Visit my name. This is Governor Sulak. That's my name. And I had a couple things I wanted to peruse through. This might be a short one. Honestly, I don't know what to say about some of these articles, but they did catch my eye. So we'll just muse a little bit. I'm gonna find a park bench and just run around. See, look how speedy I am. Whew. I designed this little Flash costume. Gold and purple. Gold pressed latinum. And, here. Just chill for a minute while we discuss from the, what is this, the Herald? Reactions vary to drag queen event. When Stuart Sanks sauntered across the Lafayette Public Library parking lot toward a sea of rainbow umbrellas, he was greeted with cheers as well as shouts from, quote, family protesters, or pro-family protesters, whose words seemed only to bounce from his bouffant pink hair. Sanks, who also wore a dress with cartoon unicorns, a necklace of oversized pearls, and glittering earrings, was ready to perform for his drag persona, surely dealt a blow as part of the library's Drag Queen Story Hour Saturday morning. The concept for Drag Queen Story Hour has spread across the nation in an effort to introduce children to, quote, unabashedly queer role models, according to its website. Maybe I'll have to go to the website. I'm not sure what makes them role models other than they are sort of being, like, representing that lifestyle to people. But other than it just being what it is, I don't understand what's laudable where they're considered role models. This event drew roughly 100 children to listen to Sanks read several stories. While this marks the 5th story hour at the Lafayette Public Library, Patty Frobisher, the library's assistant director, said it is the first to draw protests and stir passions in and outside of the community. I have feelings about this, but I don't think there's any particular, like, reason why it shouldn't be allowed to happen or anything like that. Like, I personally would not take my children to this event. But I feel like it's one of those things where I don't know. I'm just gonna muse this. Like, some of it I think is just doing your own thing and trying to make things more normative. But sometimes I just get the impression that people do things and phrase them in such a way to try to get a rise out of you, and then when you respond in protest, they're like, well, articulate exactly what the problem is, and they're kind of trolling you. And this seems to be a little bit of left-wing trolling to me. Like, there could be, like, authentic reasons for doing it, like, just making it more normal for, kids get used to seeing it, so there's, like, less social stigma. But there was an article about a lady I read. Oh, I'm not sure if I uploaded this one. I think I did. She passed away, and she was talking about stigma and how we look at it as such a bad thing to stigmatize things and to have bias-related incidents. But, bias is natural, and there's something necessary to stigma. And maybe I'll talk more about that than the particulars of this article, because I don't know how much I care about drag queen reading events. It seems like I don't know. I don't know if I have a summary that I can just cap my feelings on it. Like, I just don't get good vibes from that. It seems tacky to me, but that's a personal opinion. So as soon as I make a value judgment about, like, well, it just doesn't seem like something good to me, somebody could say, like, well, that's hate speech. And it's like, well, project on me what you will, but I have my opinions, so, whatever. But that being said, I'm going to have a little sip of my beverage here. And this is a perhaps slightly relevant musing about stigma. So I think we have interesting issues. I'm trying to encapsulate part of a conversation I had like a couple weeks ago that I thought was really interesting, and I was talking with this gentleman sort of about like identity and stigma, and a lot of people, when they have something in their life where they just feel like they can't get things together, you can almost feel empowered by getting a diagnosis or a label attached to you, because then you have a relief and you get to say, oh, well, I know what's going on. And I think different, like in the examples of what we were using, we were talking about if you have a diagnosis and then you get a medication. But I think there's something similar that can be said of like, oh, well, now I'm part of this community now, and that explains my feelings, and now I have a sense of belonging. So I think that there's something kind of healthy to that, to have a bit of an attachment to your diagnosis, but after a time, if you don't progress, and this is where I don't know if there's necessarily a parallel, but just referring to the medicine aspect, like if you, for example, become emotional and then somebody knows that you're on medication, they say, oh, did you take your medication? You feel like you're being afflicted with this stigma, but that is kind of part of the thing. Like if you have a condition and you take medication for it, and you, so I don't know, I guess to summarize what I'm getting at, like some of these terms and labels help affirm your identity for a while. The language is complicated, not affirm your identity, but it can be a reassurance to kind of give you a sense of direction. But it also carries a stigma, and I don't think either of those things are in and of themselves necessarily unhealthy. But if you are too attached to your diagnosis, that can be bad for you. And if you have stigma for having a condition or taking medication for it, I know a lot of people that take antidepressants, and then if they have any emotional issues, no matter how small, it's like, well, did you take your medication? And it kind of feels otherizing and stuff like that. So I feel like something similar is going on with a sense of identity, and then applying that to sexualizing people's identity. And then I think taking that and conveying it to children, I feel like that's not very responsible. I don't know, because these are it's complicated issues. So we'll just move along to something else here. This one is similar to another article I read about Nazism. This is a guest opinion, also in the Herald, and this one really annoyed me, and you'll probably be able to figure out why as I go through it. Nazism is harming the nation that once helped defeat it. I'm going to move over here for this one. Okay. I am a child of the Holocaust. That means my family were German Jewish refugees from the Nazis. My parents got out at the 11th hour shortly before the borders closed. My aunt was 17 years older than my mother, and the matriarch of the family survived the Riga ghetto camp. My grandmother was sent to Auschwitz and murdered. I grew up in the early 1950s with many refugees, and almost none of my elementary school classmates or Boy Scout troop comrades had grandparents. World War II is not history that I learned from dry books, but from witnesses. I volunteered to serve in the Navy in 1967 while I still had a student draft deferment. A large part of my volunteering was the desire that I had since I was an adolescent to protect my parents and family from the Nazis. In 1945, the Allies defeated the Axis military. After years of mass troops movements, thousands of ships, planes, bullets, bombs, and millions of deaths, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and imperialist Japan all signed unconditional surrenders. World War II was thought to be over. The Axis authoritarian governments were based on racial superiority and the concept of each nation being destined to run the world as an empire. This idea of masters and underlings has led to millions of deliberate murders over and above the millions killed by combat and attacks on factories, infrastructure, and populated areas. The supposition was this evil had been conquered. Some of the worst commanders have been charged by international courts, convicted and jailed, or executed. Some had escaped, changing identities, and lived in hiding. Unfortunately, that wasn't victory enough. There seems to be some percentage of human beings that are, quote, off. They are either hateful or in dire need of a supreme leader like Hitler to tell them what to do. Some are fearful. Some have been trained since birth that they are better and others should serve them. Some are just easily fooled. So that's an interesting statement, because I feel like I could kind of direct that back. So let's see. There are some percentage of human beings that are, quote, off. That kind of sounds like Nazi rhetoric to me. Certain human beings are off. It's not that we all have a capacity for bias or racism. It's that if I feel like I'm projecting things sort of at the liberal progressive identity, but when you're talking about, like, well, human beings are good, we say that they're just, inherently good. It's just socialization that makes things go wrong. And, there's just a certain portion of people that are off. So we just need to do something about those, that portion of people that's just off. It's like, well, I don't know. Maybe your philosophy can't really grapple with human realities, like the fact that we have biases and, they are either hateful or in dire need of a supreme leader like Hitler to tell them what to do. Some are fearful. They've been trained since birth that they are better than others and should they are better and others should serve them. Some are just easily fooled. So, I don't know. I just look a lot of top-down social policy that's recommended by people. Just a general argument. If you are saying that the government needs to produce solutions for a lot of, like, pretty much everything, I feel like you are kind of forcing people to make certain choices and giving them less room to be autonomous. And I feel like a lot of that is based on fear and existential angst that you are constantly interfering in people's lives. Now, to some degree, I think some of those interventions are worthy, and some of them are just busybodiness, and we need to be able to have conversations about which is which. But unfortunately, it's really hard to do that when if I don't agree with you, I happen to be a percentage of person that's off. It's not that I have a valid opinion and that we can debate about it. It just seems like any number of things and any number of triggers can just drop that portcullis down and be like, oh, what was your opinion about the trans community? What was your opinion or feeling about this? And you're going to judge me on feelings, and then we don't get to talk about any issues. I don't know what I'm talking about anymore. I just kind of went on a roll there. Let's get back to this. Here in the 21st century, 80 years after Nazism and associated horrors swept the world, it is returning, partly by military actions by Russia, Turkey, Al-Qaeda, and other extremist groups, but worst of all by a, quote, fifth column of political power grabs, the worst one being here in the United States. Yeah, I would agree, but we might differ on where that power grab is coming from. Vladimir Putin has taken advantage of the xenophobia and raw racism that seems to exist all over the world in a certain percentage of human beings. There it is again. It's not that we have a capacity for this universally. It's just that there's certain dysfunctional people, and we just need to solve them at some point, and then we can have our perfect society, right? And this guy's railing against the Nazis. With resources spent on misinformation campaigns and heavy funding given to the Trump campaign, he has installed a useful resource in the White House. As a result, hate crimes, anti-Semitism, and racial bias have skyrocketed, weakening America. Yeah, I don't know if those things are, you're giving Trump these, like, godlike powers of just controlling all of these, like, human forces and just directing them. And it's like, yeah, you can use media to some degree to kind of like corral people, but I feel like a lot of people have these feelings in them and they can be manipulated by less than scrupulous persons. and Donald Trump may very well be one of them, but there's a few others I could name. So maybe just don't say everything's coming from Trump all the time. It's just kind of goofy, especially in this context. I think you've had some interesting bouts of anti-Semitism on the left recently. I remember there was some issues with the Women's March and Ian Omar and the whole thing about the patriarchy. I've probably already said this, but I'll say this again. When you were talking about the patriarchy, you were talking about Father Abraham and the Abrahamic religions, including Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. That is the patriarchy. So when you are talking about crush the patriarchy, you're basically insinuating you want to crush Jewish identity. Now, some people say that Jewish identity is not tied to the God of Israel, but I don't know. So I don't know the nuances of all of that. I just know that there seems to be a big cultural divide between those that do observe and then those that don't observe, and they seem not to have each other's backs, especially when it comes to a journalistic narrative about anti-Semitism. I'm not sure exactly what I meant by that, but I'm not going to elaborate now. Moving on. Also, as a result, we are separating children from their parents and putting them into camps the same way Hitler did in the early 1930s. Not the same way. Not the same way. Just general retorts to that kind of argument. Barack Obama built those camps, and now that they're being used by the Great Orange Satan, they are bad. But if he was using it before, like, if Barack Obama orders a drone strike, it is destroying, neutralizing an enemy combatant. But if Donald Trump does it, it's assassinating a foreign leader. It's just a language game. It gets obnoxious. And as far as these camps are concerned, I think the whole idea was that you were free to not enter the country or free to leave the country. It's not that you're not allowed to leave and we're going to use you for forced labor. If anything, we are detaining and holding these people at exorbitant expense. And so we need better solutions than just using this hyperbolic nonsense about concentration camps. It's so fucking dumb. It's completely unacceptable. It's really annoying. And the fact that people take it seriously and then still publish it, it's like, this is complete nonsense. It's so useless. While the Nazis were defeated militarily, they, like undermining a dam by underground water, have done tremendous harm to the country most heavily responsible for their defeat. World War II is not over. It has simply changed form. American patriots must put aside differences, as we did after Pearl Harbor and 9/11, and work together to win again. Yeah, it's hard to put aside differences when you can't speak, asshole. I'm so sorry. I'm not holding you personally responsible for this, but when you contribute this and you're like, well, that's the racist president and the racist supporters, and you just kind of cast shade at people based on power dynamics, I don't know how to treat you and I don't know how to speak to you. And the fact that you find it acceptable makes things very complicated. It makes it difficult because it's like, well, we really have nothing to say to each other. You talk about putting aside our differences, for our American identities, and I go, well, what exactly is that now? Because it seems like if you can't win elections by persuading people, which if you're calling them racist and bigot and transphobe and homophobe, like, you're not interested in persuading people. At this point, it's basically changing the demographics of the country until you can get a majority, and then just using that power as much as possible to change policy. But if it's in the interest of people, like, man, I'm really going on a tear here, I'm gonna keep going. Like states' rights. If you have a state and you want to live a certain way, that would be the true diversity, wouldn't it? Like, we can have these diverse areas where people live differently because the natural resources are different there, and the budget is different there, and the attitudes of the people are different there because, they live a different way. That's diversity. Instead, we're just going to sort of replace the demographics of people in different areas and then put capital D diversity and capital I inclusion, and they're all euphemisms that don't really reflect what most people associate with language. So I'm just kind of rolling on there. Did I have another one?